Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your time. The topic for today's discussion is a case study on enterprise risk management for one of the biggest power transmission InvITs in India. Before we deep dive into the nuances and approach that I took for performing this exercise, I would like to briefly talk about what is enterprise risk management, what are the different types of risk, and what are the steps that one should take to perform this exercise. ERM is an exercise to identify risk at an entity level and monitor and manage mitigating controls to manage the risk at an accepted level. There are different types of risk that an entity can face: financial, technological, strategic, environmental, external, so on and so forth. The steps that one should take to perform enterprise risk management are as follows. First, identify risk. Second, assess the risk through identifying the impact and likelihood. Third would be to identify the mitigating controls that should be there in place. Fourth would be to implement those mitigating controls to bring the risk to an acceptable level. And fifth, monitor those risks. It can be done through periodic review of the ERM framework and internal audits. Now, let's talk about our case study pertaining to the power transmission InvIT. First and foremost, to identify the risk, we did some internal research to identify the risk. There were several documents which we went through. First and foremost was the transmission agreements with Power Grid, the revenue agreements with DISCOMs, what were the government policies and procedures pertaining to InvIT, what are the basic challenges which a power transmission industry is facing in today's scenario, and what are the future risks that power transmission entities are going to face. These all research helped us in understanding what are the risks within the industry, pertain specifically both internal and external. Based on which we developed a questionnaire to discuss with the CXOs. This included CEO, CFO, CRO, Chief Risk Officer, Chief Information Officer, and so on and so forth. By having risk-based interviews with them, we validated the risk that we felt are important for that particular entity, and we also took their inputs in understanding the entity-specific risk. Now, after doing multiple discussions, we came up with a list of okay, what are the key risks for the organization. Just to give you a few examples pertaining to information technology, cyber attack and data leakages can be one and the most important risk because they are connected to the national grid. Secondly, inability to raise finance. Third, inability to get regular revenue from power grid. Fourth would be dependency on government regulations, as their revenue was highly dependent on how government policies used to mandate. So these are certain examples of risk which we highlighted during this exercise. Second exercise was to assess the risk. Now we categorize the risk in high, medium, and low, and to do that we had to identify what is the potential impact and likelihood of each risk. We basically devised a base scale from 1 to 5 for impact and similarly for likelihood, 1 being lowest and 5 being highest. So depending on different parameters, we assessed what can be a potential impact and likelihood for one particular risk. Multiplying by the impact and likelihood, we arrived at a risk score. Based on the risk score, we decided whether a particular risk is high, medium, or low. For example, data leakages and security threats. This being one of the most important and a red high risk for the entity, as it can disrupt the organization and operations uh, immediately. Similarly, dependency on power grid for revenue was considered as low risk because we have a 35-year, the entity had a 35-year long agreement with power grid to supply uh, power on a regular basis. So that was perceived as a low risk. Now, we know what is a high risk, medium risk, and low risk. The next step was to identify what are the mitigating controls in place. Obviously, there were certain controls which were already there in place. However, we had to suggest to the entity what are the expected additional controls that they should put in place to mitigate the risk at an acceptable level. Just to take one example, security risk and data leakages. The risk that they had in place was they had built in firewalls and necessary antiviruses to ensure that no foreign virus or software can get into their system. However, the additional control that we suggested that should be part of their framework was to do an exhaustive cybersecurity exercise, understand what are the vulnerabilities and threats to their particular grid as it is connected to the national grid. So this not only helped in identifying what are the mitigation steps that they have to take, but it also helped them in coming with a roadmap on how they can manage their framework better. The next step was to discuss these findings with the audit committee and board. Here we came up with a framework where we listed the top 10 or 15 risk with the entity, with the board, and we highlighted what are the risk score, and we highlighted what are the high risk, medium risk, and low risk. We also helped them with a roadmap on how they can bring the high risk to a medium risk, thereby to an acceptable level by doing few mitigating controls, and which included what are the immediate steps that needs to be taken in the next 3 months, next 6 months, and next 1 year. Now, this exercise is great. It helped them a lot. It gave them a roadmap. But this is not it. As I mentioned to you before, monitoring such entity risk at a regular interval is very important. As part of ERM, it's a continuous monitoring exercise where on a periodic basis, generally on a quarterly basis, you review your framework, understand where are you doing, how are you doing on those mitigating controls, and reassess whether those risks are still high or it can be brought down to medium, and medium can be brought down to low. And at the same time, add any additional risk which has emerged. For example, COVID-19 is an excellent example. This is something which no one dreamt about. Now, this is an additional risk which should be included as part of our framework. Hope this entire interaction was very helpful, where we spoke about what is the approach on doing ERM, what was the steps that I took for performing ERM for a power transmission company. Please reach out to me for further questions. Thank you.